Is Danielle Morin, and this presentation is going to focus on metaphysical poetry, what it is, who the poets involved were, and then a specific poem from this style. In today's lesson, we're going to look at four main objectives. First, what is metaphysical poetry in terms of its styles, themes, and poets involved? Then we'll look at Andrew Marvell, one of the many metaphysical poets of this time. We'll talk briefly about his biography and look at some of his famous poems. Next, we're going to do a reading of his poem, a dialogue between the soul and body, my favorite of his poems. And finally, the last part of this presentation will be an explicating in the poems by summarizing, explaining, and discussing it. So what is metaphysical poetry? Let's look at its style, themes, and some of the poets contributing to this genre. Metaphysical poetry is defined by Webster as a highly intellectualized poetry marked by bold and ingenuous conceits, incongruous imagery, complexity and subtlety of thought, frequent use of paradox, and often by deliberate harshness or rigidity of expression. Encyclopedia Britannica describes the metaphysical poets by saying their work is a blend of emotion and intellectual ingenuity, characterized by conceit or wit, that is, by the sometimes violent yoking together of apparently unconnected ideas and things, so that the reader is startled out of his complacency and forced to think through the argument of the poem. Metaphysical poetry is less concerned with expressing feeling than with analyzing it, with the poet exploring the recesses of his consciousness. The boldness of the literary devices used, especially obliquity, irony, and paradox, are often reinforced by a dramatic directness of language and by rhythms derived from that of living speech. Fancy terms, so let's break this down into its main characteristics. Metaphysical poetry pertains to philosophical questions that cannot be explained by science. They range from topics of religion to the consciousness. All metaphysical poets question and think about reality. The poems contain a lot of wit and humor, and one big way that they use wit is by taking two things that you normally wouldn't pair together in a metaphor and pairing them together in a metaphor. And we're going to see some examples of this in Andrew Marvell's poem as well. They also use paradoxes and puns, and many explore the idea of carpe diem and the existence of life itself. Finally, all have a religious sentiment. There are numerous metaphysical poets, but some of the central figures that contributed to this genre are John Donne, George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell, and Richard Crashaw. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be looking at Andrew Marvell. Andrew Marvell is one of the renowned metaphysical poets. Let's look at his biography and some of his greatest works. The Poetry Foundation describes Andrew Marvell in this way. He's a fitting symbol for England's transformation in the 17th century from what was still a largely medieval Christian culture into a modern secular society. In his subtle, ironic, and sometimes mysterious lyrics, apparently written just at the middle of the century, we have one of our finest records of an acute, sensitive mind, confronting the myriad implications of that transformation. He was really influential in this genre. He lived from 1621 to 1678, and he was a British metaphysical poet. He was educated at Hull Grammar School until the age of 13. He attended Trinity College later on in life at Cambridge and received his degree in 1639. Later, he was elected to represent in Parliament in the House of Commons. This started in 1659, and he continued to represent until his death in 1678. His poetry has a political aspect to it, which is probably influenced by his involvement in politics. And sadly, he died of an opiate overdose that he was taking due to ague, which is an illness similar to malaria with symptoms like fever. Some of his most famous poems include The Gallery, To His Coy Mistress, A Dialogue Between the Soul and Body, The Character of Holland, The Mower's Song, and Eyes and Tears. Next, we're going to look at my favorite poem of his, A Dialogue Between the Soul and Body. So let's go ahead and do a quick reading of this poem. Soul. Oh, who shall from this dungeon raise a soul enslaved so many ways, with bolts of bones that fettered stands, in feet and manacled in hands, with an eye, and there deaf with the drumming of an ear, a soul hung up as 'twere in chains of nerves and arteries and veins, tortured beside each other part, in a vain head and double heart. Oh, who shall me deliver whole from bonds of this tyrannic soul, which stretch upright, impale me so, that mine own precipice I go, and warms and moves this needless frame, a fever could but do the same, and wanting where its spites to try, has made me live, to let me that could never rest, since this ill spirit it possessed. Oh, what magic could me thus confine, within another's grief to pine, where whatsoever it complain, I feel that cannot feel the pain. Care itself employs, that to preserve which me destroys, constrained not only to endure diseases, but, what's worse, the cure, and ready oft the port to gain, am shipwrecked into health again. But physic yet could never reach the maladies thou me dost teach, whom first the cramp of hope does tear, and then the palsy shakes of fear. Pestilence of love does heat, or hatred's hidden ulcer eat, joy's cheerful madness does perplex, or sorrow's other madness vex, which knowledge forces me to know, and memory will not forego. But a soul could have the wit to build me up for sin so fit, so architects do swear and hew green trees that in the forest grew. Now that we've read the poem, let's take a closer look at understanding it. There are three main points we can use to summarize the entirety of this poem. First, it's a conflict between the soul and the body. That's pretty obvious. Both discuss why each other has it worse. And finally, we get an ending without any real resolution. This leaves it open for the reader to ponder what's going on and determine what they think the answer to the questions posed in this poem might be. Within the poem, we see issues that both the soul and body are struggling with. Let's break those down and see how each side feels disadvantaged. So the soul is like the mind. This is the conscious part of your existence. The mind is imprisoned, constrained, and tortured by the body. So in an interesting metaphor here, we see chains compared to bodily parts. So a soul hung up as 'twere in chains of nerves and arteries and veins. And we don't normally think of our body parts as chains, but for a soul that's trapped inside of a body, we could kind of see how that would make sense. And then as the body lives, the soul dies because it wants to live outside of the body. With metaphysical poetry, there's certainly a religious aspect. So you want to consider the fact that the soul is destined to enter heaven once the body passes away. So as the body continues to live, the soul is actually dying because it's not living the way that it wants to live. And you can see this when Marvell writes, to preserve, which me destroys, talking about the soul. Constrained not only to endure diseases, but what's worse, the cure, and ready off to port the gain, am shipwrecked into health again. So while diseases are terrible, the cure is worse for the body. And we normally wouldn't talk about health being something that you are shipwrecked into. But this interesting paradox shows us that for the soul, what's good for the body is not necessarily good for the soul. Now, the body is controlled by the soul. So the soul forces the body to live, only to let it die in the end. And for the body, this in itself is a form of torture. We see this when it writes, has wanting where its spikes to try, has made me live to let me die. The body cannot rest because the soul, or like your mind, is always racing. So this can be a form of anxiety. So he says, a body that could never rest since this ill spirit it possessed. So it's feeling possessed by its own soul. And I think it's natural to think that we sometimes feel possessed or trapped by our own thoughts and anxieties. The body also complains that the mind brings much worse illness than physical illness that the body itself must endure. But physic yet could never reach the maladies that thou me dost teach. In other words, whatever I could go through physically is nothing compared to the injuries that I've received from you, the soul. Some of those injuries are fear, loss of hope, sorrow, and even hatred, which he compares to an ulcer eating away at him. The body is also cursed with knowledge and memories. It says, which knowledge forces me to know, and memory will not forego. So sometimes those memories that you don't want to remember are still trapped in the mind itself. And then finally, the soul causes the body to sin. And we see this at the end when he writes, what but a soul could have the wit to build me up for sin so fit? So architects do square and hew green trees that in the forest grew. So just like trees grow in the forest on their own, an architect is the one who comes around and prunes them and turns them into something else, whatever that architect wants it to be. In the same way, the soul molds the body through its consciousness and causes it to do things that maybe in its natural state it wouldn't want to do. This poem touches on many philosophical ideas typical of a metaphysical poem. So the poem itself poses the reader many questions. So let's go ahead and look at those now. Which has it worse, the soul or the body? Well, the body must endure physical and mental injuries and pain, but the soul is forever trapped and tortured. We don't really get a clear answer as to which one Marvell believes to have it worse. This is a question that the reader is left to ponder. Is it true that the body would be better off without the soul, and vice versa? A body without a soul would feel that it wasn't being drawn to evil and could be free from control. However, it would have no driving force, no memories, or no knowledge. A soul without a body could be free to reside in heaven where it feels it belongs. However, it would not be able to live out its purpose without a body to use as a vessel. It seems that the two, although they live in turmoil with one another, could not exist in entirety without the other. Which leads us to our third question. Can the two ever exist in peace? Well, this might be one of the more heavy-handed questions the poem poses. Can anyone live with these two entities in peace? If it is possible, would that be achieving the ultimate level of humanity and life? So this idea is that of a higher level of existence, and it's something that metaphysical poets would have considered. So in order to attain a higher level of human existence, the only way to do that would be somehow to understand the dichotomy of the two presences within you, and then learn how to master those two so that they can exist in peace. So what does this conflict tell us about existence or human nature? Well, the poem tells us a lot about human nature and existence. So as humans, we are in a constant battle between right and wrong, happiness and sadness, love and hatred. Perhaps, as Marvell is suggesting, the reason for this dichotic existence is due to this ongoing internal battle between our body and our soul that it seems like can never be fixed. But that's up to you to decide. So the philosophical questions, styles of the questioning existence of abstract and pondering the state of the soul are all characteristics of metaphysical poetry. And this is just one example from one of the great poets that existed during the time of metaphysical poetry in the 17th century. So thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.